The year was 1951, and Black activist Ulysses Smith was attempting to enter the pool at Palisades Park in New Jersey. 2 years prior, New Jersey had passed the Free Men Civil Rights Act, which specifically named pools as a public accommodation where segregation was prohibited. However, there was a big difference between the legalities of the situation and the social norms of the time period. While the law had a certain level of importance in the struggle over recreation in America, it did not have the power to enforce equal access to public accommodations, meaning that just because the law said that Ulysses was allowed in the pool didn't mean that local whites were going to allow it to happen. A possibly surprising fact is that most northern and border states had civil rights laws and yet still had segregated recreational facilities. Some southern communities didn't even have segregation laws mandating separate facilities, and yet Blacks were included in few recreational activities. What this translates to is that saying that civil rights laws came and immediately saved Blacks from the cruelties of segregation is a gross simplification of history. Integration of public recreational facilities required hard, consistent work and bravery to face racist whites and other common setbacks. The same summer that Ulysses attempted to enter the Palisades Park pool, whites firebombed and gutted an apartment building after a Black family moved into an all-white suburb named Cicero in Chicago. Violence was one of a few common tactics that white Americans used against Black Americans to deter integration, whether that be in housing, education, or recreation. So the firebombing of a Black family's apartment in Cicero was supposed to serve as a warning to any integration-loving Black American. In fact, it was explicitly used as a warning to Ulysses when the guard to the pool asked him whether he wanted to create an incident such as had occurred in Cicero. Threats like these were commonplace and effective in segregated America. Violence wasn't just used as a threat to Black activists and everyday people involved in the struggle. It was often used by powerful whites to reinforce arguments for legal and cultural segregation. Whenever activists and everyday participants would resist and intermix with their white neighbors, violence would often come about, usually incited by the white Americans who felt entitled to a homogenized space. From there, judges and politicians would use the argument that desegregation would only bring issues as demonstrated by past race riots. For example, in 1956, after a race riot broke out at the Crystal Beach amusement park, local Blacks immediately grieved what they knew was coming. The series of racial incidents would be used by the media to scare white Americans away from integration. Headlines like "Negro Knifers Turn Outings to Nightmare" convinced local politicians and citizens around the country that the time for integration was not then. While violence was the most physical and fear-inducing reaction to attempts by Blacks to desegregate, what was equally, if not more effective, was legal methods of keeping Blacks out. One of those methods was privatization. After many made their pools private to go past the law, there wasn't much that Blacks could do about it. Unlike voting or education, there was no such thing as the right to a public pool. And if they couldn't maintain segregation through privatization, many would simply close down instead of complying with the law. 2 years after the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott that launched Martin Luther King into the national spotlight, 8 local Black Americans attempted to desegregate the city's parks and pools as well. They filed the lawsuit to fully integrate Montgomery's public parks, and in response, the city of Montgomery closed 12 of its parks. This response was not uncommon. In fact, a similar occurrence happened in Lynchburg, Virginia, where Black Americans approached city officials about desegregating city pools in 1961. When the city officials refused and suggested that all pools would close if Black Americans attempted to swim, local Blacks jumped into a white pool in defiance on Independence Day. The city promptly closed all of its pools after this demonstration. The federal city district could demand that the city end the policy of pool segregation with a class action suit, and they did, but they couldn't force Lynchburg to reopen the pools. If segregation could not be maintained at publicly owned recreational facilities, selling to private owners was a dangerously lucrative solution. In 1956, 4 years before the Greensboro Four would sit down at the Woolworth lunch counter, a group of Black Americans in Greensboro, North Carolina sued the city over Lindley Park swimming pool. After the group was refused access to the pool, they decided to file a suit against the city to force integration. Instead of facing the suit, the city promptly sold the pool. What we can learn from the struggle over desegregating recreational facilities is that believing that changes in legislation were an end-all be-all is historically inaccurate. Through methods like keeping private guards who discourage blacks from entering, facilities maintained segregation despite the passage of civil rights laws throughout the United States. Even when cases were taken to court, civil rights laws were either ignored or only resulted in a small fine. And yet, brave and persistent Black Americans were willing to band together and successfully integrate segregational facilities. Though the legacy of desegregating recreational facilities feels distant, the same stereotypes surrounding Black people in the 1950s and 60s are still prevalent today. To this day, Blacks are often assumed to be dangerous, obnoxious, or even violent. We can see everyday examples of this in the news stories such as Black Americans getting the police called on them for family cookouts, bird-watching outings, and even entering a Starbucks. These stereotypes cannot be stopped until America starts confronting its past in order to understand how that history connects the experiences of Black Americans today.